In just 4 days in September 1666, fire consumed over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and left more than 100,000 Londoners homeless. The Great Fire of London didn't just destroy a city, it changed the course of British history forever. In this video, I use modern AI tools to reconstruct what London looked like before, during, and after the Great Fire of 1666. We'll walk the streets as they burn, witness the panic, and understand how a single spark in a bakery turned into one of history's most devastating urban disasters. London in the summer of 1666 was a city waiting to burn. Over 80,000 buildings were crammed inside the old Roman walls and beyond. Most were built entirely of wood, with timber frames, wooden shingles, and walls packed with straw and pitch. These structures stood so close together that neighbors could lean out their windows and shake hands across the street. The summer had been brutally hot and dry. No significant rain had fallen for 10 months. The Thames River had shrunk to its lowest level in living memory. Wells ran dry. Wooden buildings, baked by the sun for months, had become tinder. Their timbers had cracked and dried. Their thatched roofs were brittle as kindling. The streets were narrow, some barely wide enough for a cart. They twisted and turned without logic, following medieval property lines that had existed for centuries. Upper floors jutted outward over the streets below, creating dark tunnels where sunlight rarely reached the ground. Rubbish piled in corners, animal waste mixed with human waste in open gutters. Fire was already a constant threat. Every home had an open hearth, every workshop used flame. Candles lit the night. But London had no fire brigade, no organized response. When fires started, neighbors formed bucket chains, passing leather buckets of water hand to hand. If a fire grew too large, they used fire hooks, long poles with hooks at the end, to pull down burning buildings and create gaps the fire couldn't cross. But these methods required water, and in the summer of 1666, water was scarce.
Monday, September 3rd, brought no relief. The wind continued to blow. The fire continued to spread. By now, it had consumed everything east of Grace Church Street and was moving toward the financial heart of London. The Royal Exchange, where merchants conducted business, caught fire. Its roof collapsed inward, sending sparks flying in every direction. Nearby streets, packed with shops selling luxury goods, silks, spices, and jewelry, were engulfed. Shopkeepers who had stayed to protect their goods now fled empty-handed. King Charles II took personal command of the firefighting efforts. He and his brother, James, Duke of York, rode through the burning streets, directing soldiers and volunteers. They ordered the creation of fire breaks, demolishing buildings in the fire's path to create gaps it couldn't cross. But the fire moved faster than they could work. The technique required gunpowder to blow up buildings quickly, but Lord Mayor Bloodworth hesitated to authorize its use. He worried about the cost of rebuilding. He worried about legal liability. While he hesitated, the fire advanced. By Monday evening, the fire had reached Cheapside, one of London's main thoroughfares. This wide street, lined with goldsmiths and wealthy merchants, had always seemed immune to fire. But nothing could stop this inferno. Buildings that had stood for 300 years burned in minutes. The heat was unbearable. Witnesses described molten lead from roofs pouring down gutters like rivers. Stone walls exploded from the heat. Iron gates twisted and bent. The very air seemed to burn. Tuesday, September 4th, was the worst day. The fire reached St. Paul's Cathedral, the largest church in England. This massive stone structure, with its ancient timbers and lead roof, had stood for 600 years. People believed it was fireproof. They were wrong. The wooden scaffolding surrounding the cathedral, erected for long overdue repairs, caught fire first. Flames climbed the scaffold and reached the roof. The lead melted and poured down like rain. Inside, the wooden beams supporting the roof caught fire. The temperature rose so high that the stones themselves began to crack and explode, sending deadly projectiles flying through the air.
By Tuesday afternoon, St. Paul's Cathedral was an inferno. The roof collapsed inward with a sound like thunder. Flames shot through the windows hundreds of feet high. The heat was so intense that it could be felt half a mile away. Books stored in the cathedral's crypt for safekeeping ignited spontaneously. Ancient manuscripts, irreplaceable records, centuries of history, all turned to ash. Around the cathedral, the city burned. Guildhall, the center of London's government, caught fire. Its great hall, where mayors had been elected and justice dispensed for 400 years, collapsed. The Guildhall's massive oak roof beams, each as thick as a man's body, burned like candles. The fire had now created its own weather. The intense heat generated powerful updrafts, pulling in air from all directions and creating winds of its own. These winds carried burning embers for miles, starting new fires far ahead of the main blaze. Firefighters found themselves fighting flames in multiple locations simultaneously, unable to contain any of them. 87 parish churches were burning. The skyline, once punctuated by church spires, was now a wall of flame and smoke. The smoke was so thick that miles away in Oxford, people thought the sky had turned dark. On the ground, chaos reigned. Families pushed through smoke-filled streets, desperate to reach safety. Some carried elderly relatives on their backs, others dragged children by the hand. Prisoners were released from Newgate Prison as the fire approached, turned loose into the burning streets rather than left to die in their cells. The wealthy fled to open spaces, Moorfields, Smithfield, and Islington Fields, where they camped with whatever possessions they had saved. The poor, with nowhere to go and nothing to save, simply watched as their entire lives burned. Some Londoners blamed foreigners. Paranoia spread that French or Dutch agents had started the fire deliberately. Mobs attacked anyone who looked or sounded foreign. Several innocent people were beaten. A French watchmaker was nearly lynched before soldiers intervened. King Charles II remained in the city throughout the fire, refusing to retreat to safety. He worked alongside commoners, passing buckets, helping to demolish buildings, and offering coins from his own purse to encourage firefighters. His presence steadied nerves and prevented complete panic. The Duke of York organized the military response. He divided London into sectors, assigning army officers to each one with orders to create fire breaks at any cost. Finally, they began to use gunpowder effectively. Buildings exploded in controlled demolitions, creating gaps the fire couldn't cross. But the wind continued to blow. Every firebreak created on the eastern side of the city was rendered useless as the fire simply went around it. By Wednesday, September 5th, the fire had reached the western edges of the city. It was approaching the Temple, the center of London's legal profession, and the mansions of the aristocracy along the Strand. If it reached these areas, it would threaten Whitehall Palace itself. Then, late on Wednesday afternoon, the wind finally changed. It died down, then shifted direction. The fire, which had been driven relentlessly westward for 4 days, suddenly found itself moving against the wind. Its advance slowed. The flames, which had leaped from building to building with ease, now struggled to cross even narrow gaps. The fire breaks, finally effective without the wind to carry embers across them, began to work. Soldiers and volunteers, exhausted beyond measure, managed to contain the remaining fires. Building by building, street by street, they fought the flames to a standstill. By Thursday morning, September 6th, the Great Fire was effectively over.
A few buildings still smoldered, smoke still rose from the ruins, but the main inferno had been defeated.
When the smoke finally cleared, Londoners could see what they had lost. The devastation was almost incomprehensible. The fire had destroyed 13,200 houses, about 80% of the city. 87 churches had burned, including St. Paul's Cathedral. The Royal Exchange, Guildhall, the Custom House, and most of the livery company halls were gone. 400 streets had been reduced to ash and rubble. The area of destruction stretched from the Tower of London in the east to the Temple in the west, and from the Thames River in the south to the edge of the medieval walls in the north. Nearly 450 acres, about 373 acres inside the walls and 63 acres outside, had been reduced to blackened ruins. The human cost was difficult to measure. Official records claimed only 6 deaths, but this number is certainly wrong. Many bodies were completely consumed by the fire, leaving no trace. The poor, who had no one to report their deaths, were not counted. Modern historians estimate that dozens, possibly hundreds, died in the flames or from injuries and exposure afterward. More than 100,000 people, roughly half of London's population, were left homeless. They camped in the fields surrounding the city, sleeping under canvas if they were lucky, under the open sky if they were not. Disease spreads quickly, food was scarce, winter was coming. The economic impact was catastrophic. The fire had destroyed goods worth millions of pounds. Merchants who had warehouses in the burned area lost everything. Insurance as we know it didn't exist, so there was no compensation. Many businesses never recovered. The fire also destroyed irreplaceable historical records. Parish registers dating back centuries, guild records, legal documents, personal papers all turned to ash. Entire family histories vanished. Property boundaries became disputed because the deeds had burned. In the immediate aftermath, people wanted answers. How had the fire started? Could it have been prevented? Was someone to blame? A parliamentary committee was formed to investigate. They interviewed Thomas Farriner, the baker in whose shop the fire had started. He swore he had checked his ovens and damped his fires before going to bed. He blamed a spark from a neighbor's chimney, but everyone knew the fire had started in his bakery. The committee also investigated the conspiracy theories. Several people, driven by fear or seeking to deflect blame, claimed the fire had been deliberately set by Catholics or foreign agents. A French watchmaker named Robert Hubert confessed to starting the fire, though his confession was clearly false. He hadn't even been in London when the fire started. Nevertheless, he was hanged. Lord Mayor Bloodworth faced severe criticism for his initial dismissal of the fire and his hesitation to authorize the demolition of buildings. His reputation never recovered. But most blame fell on the city itself, on its ancient, cramped layout, its wooden construction, and its lack of adequate firefighting provisions. The fire had been a disaster waiting to happen. It had taken a perfect storm of conditions, drought, wind, and dense wooden construction, but it had always been inevitable. King Charles II moved quickly to prevent panic and maintain order. He issued a proclamation promising that London would be rebuilt and better than before. He called for plans to redesign the city with wider streets, stone buildings, and proper fire precautions. The rebuilding of London began almost immediately. King Charles II appointed a commission of 6 men to oversee the reconstruction. Among them were Christopher Wren, a brilliant architect and scientist, and Robert Hooke, an equally talented polymath. Grand plans were proposed. Wren submitted a design for a completely new London with wide, straight streets radiating from central plazas like Paris or Rome. It would have been magnificent. But it was impractical. Property ownership in London was complex, with thousands of individual owners. Redrawing the entire city would have meant decades of legal disputes. Instead, London was rebuilt largely on its old medieval street plan, but the buildings themselves were transformed. The new Building Act of 1667 mandated that all new buildings be constructed of brick or stone, not timber. Walls had to be a certain thickness, roofs had to be covered with tile or slate, not thatch. Streets had to be widened where possible. These regulations worked. London would never again suffer a fire of this magnitude. The new brick and stone city was far more fire-resistant than its medieval predecessor. Christopher Wren was appointed to oversee the rebuilding of London's churches. Over the next 40 years, he designed 51 new churches to replace those destroyed in the fire. His masterpiece was the new St. Paul's Cathedral, which took 35 years to complete. Its massive dome became the defining symbol of London's skyline. The reconstruction also improved public health. The fire had destroyed the worst slums, the most overcrowded neighborhoods, and the breeding grounds of plague and disease. When London was rebuilt, it was more spacious, better ventilated, and far healthier. By 1672, most of the rebuilding was complete. By 1680, London had not only recovered, but had surpassed its pre-fire population and prosperity. The city had been transformed from a medieval town into a modern metropolis. The Great Fire of London changed more than just buildings. It changed how cities were built, how fires were fought, and how disasters were managed. The fire led directly to the creation of fire insurance. Before 1666, no such thing existed. After the fire, several companies were formed to offer fire insurance to property owners. These companies created their own private fire brigades, which would only fight fires in buildings they insured. Each brigade had distinctive badges or fire marks that they placed on insured buildings. It was an imperfect system, but it was the beginning of organized firefighting. The fire also demonstrated the importance of building codes and urban planning. London's new regulations became a model for other cities. The principle that governments had a responsibility to regulate construction for public safety was established. The fire marked the end of medieval London and the beginning of modern London. The old city, with its roots in Roman times and its character shaped by 1,000 years of medieval growth, was gone forever. In its place rose a Georgian city of brick and stone, more orderly, more rational, and more prepared for the future. Interestingly, the Great Fire may have had one unexpected benefit. London had been devastated by plague the previous year, with over 100,000 deaths. Many historians believe the fire helped end the plague by destroying the rats and fleas that carried the disease. Whether or not this is true, London never experienced another major plague outbreak. The monument to the Great Fire, a massive column designed by Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke, was erected near Pudding Lane where the fire began. It stands 202 feet tall, exactly the distance from its base to the site of Farriner's Bakery. Visitors can still climb its 311 steps today. At the top, an inscription reminds us of the fire's destruction and London's remarkable recovery. The Great Fire of London burned for 4 days in September 1666, destroying most of the medieval city and leaving 100,000 people homeless. But from the ashes rose a new London, safer, healthier, and more magnificent than before. The fire that nearly destroyed London ultimately made it stronger. What aspect of the Great Fire surprised you most, and what historical event or city should I reconstruct next? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.